is being brought to you by the IndicForum. My IndicForum partner Akshar Prabhudesai is on the call as well. And we have started the IndicForum to bring forth Indic scholars and other personalities who are contributing towards wonderful things, may it be art, culture, even health, all different types of areas. And so this is a forum where people can come and post things, have discussions, and we're very excited to have Dr. Gupt with us today, and the topic is Gender and Sexuality in Ancient India. So quick introduction about Dr. Gupt. Dr. Bharat Gupt is a retired associate professor in English who has taught at the College of Vocational Studies at the University of Delhi. Dr. Gupt is an Indian classicist, theater theorist, musician and musicologist, cultural analyst, and also a scholar. And he also writes columns in newspapers. Dr. Gupt is an expert in ancient Indian texts, such as the Kama Sutra, and has delivered numerous workshops, talks on his book and his other works. So, namaskar, welcome Dr. Gupt. Thank you for being with us today.
Very happy.
Good. We will jump into questions, and this is how we will do this. For 30 minutes, we can have a guided question and answer session, and then we will open it up to everyone. So the first question for you, Dr. Gupt, is what are some of the ancient Indian texts which discuss human sexuality?
Well, I'm very happy to be here with you all. It's a great opportunity, and I hope I will see some old friends. Maybe some people I met 2 years ago in California and in Houston. Of course, I met you, Anjali, in Houston. So we start on this. Now, the first question, what are the texts that talk about Indian sexuality or Indian eroticism? And what are the major texts? Now, it's not an easy thing to give you an answer because there is not one single text. Of course, everybody can just talk about the Kama Sutra and say that the Kama Sutra is the cardinal text. But then there is not one Kama Sutra. There are at least a dozen of them. There is a whole line of them. There was a tradition of it. And then there are so many other texts about various other arts, music, theater, dance, sculpture, painting, etc., which all talk about the subject of sexuality. And what is most important is the fact that out of the 4 aims of life, dharma, artha, kama, and moksha, kama or sexuality has been declared to be one of the aims of human life. Human life should have 4 things before it: dharma, artha, which is making money or collecting good things in life for you; kama, that is desires. And that, of course, comes in the question desires which are legitimate, illegitimate, so and so forth. And then moksha, which means that you finally go towards the highest end of life. So these are the 4 aims of life, out of which kama is one of the most important. And if that is so, then a text which is dealing with various other activities gets related to sexuality. So when you talk of Kama Sutra, then we are talking about a very specific kind of activity. That is the activity of the union of the male and the female at the bodily level, at the level of carnal pleasure. And then there is the other level which is the level of a social significance. A man and a woman, they unite in order to form a union for a social purpose, which includes then dharma and artha, because you reproduce, you raise good citizens, you give able people to the world, boys and girls, and then that is also the purpose of kama or sexuality. And then the third level, which is very important, is that whether it is just physical desire or it is just marriage, all this is not just done perfunctorily. It is not done simply for the sake of individual or social pleasure or purpose. It is done beautifully. So in comes the input of aesthetic, that sexuality is something which has to be charming, which has to be beautiful, which has to be with mutual consent and mutual joy of the sexual partners. And it has to be associated with a higher pleasure in life, the pleasure of arts. And therefore sexuality becomes shringara, and shringara associated with beauty through various arts, song, dance, music, literature, poetry, etc. Everything. Then the fourth level is that you make the relationship between the male and the female, or between the two partners of intense love and devotion, a paradigm for the relationship between the individual Atma and the Paramatma, or the great cosmic reality. So these are the four levels of sexuality which have been deeply thought about, analyzed, codified and practiced, and therefore there is not one single text but a large number of texts. There are texts about kama at the physical level, then there are texts about marriage, then there are texts about aesthetic pleasure, that is performance, Natya Shastra, the life of courtesans, the life of the Nagarik or the citizen, and then there are texts about seeking the divine. So we have texts and texts and texts for Indian sexuality.
I see.
Yeah.
Seeking a little bit of clarification, Dr. Gupt.
Yeah.
Are sexuality and eroticism interchangeable, or is that just a bad translation?
I would say that there is a use of these words in the Western parlance, and then we have the Indian terms. Now, sexuality in India would be best described by one single word, which is kama. But then, kama would vary according to time, location, place, person, and why do you want that particular relationship. So kama is a very pervasive term. It means anything which is associated with desire and also with the erotic desire in particular. So that is the Indian term, which is a very wide one, because sexuality, as I tried to explain, has these four levels of practice and experience in the Indian system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. So we know that there are multiple texts which refer to sexuality and their dimensions.
Yes.
That you mentioned and talked about.
Yeah.
How has these views evolved over time, or have they?
Well, they have, of course, evolved, and more than evolution, I think in the Indian system, what has happened is creation of an immense variety. You see, the term evolution has a very strong Western bias because it means going from something lower towards something higher. It always has this Darwinian kind of climbing up the ladder from lower to higher. Now, in the Indian system, there is no such thing that when there is creation, then creation is part of the divine. Because Srishti or creation is part of the Creator. And therefore that is also divine. And it is always there. So that does not evolve, but it only unfolds. And it unfolds in all kinds of beautiful things, in all kinds of places, with immense variety. You see, this is how it happens. So there is an evolution, if you want to use that term, in terms of time and place. So we'll have certainly a definition of sexuality, let us say, in the very early classical times. Then we'll have something which is more associated with arts in the later classical times. And then in the medieval times, when social conditions change, then many things change. So it's a matter of how people use their karma or how they use their desire at different times and different places. Conditions were not the same, let us say, in 15th century India as they were in the minds of Indian people within India. And number two, what are the misconceptions in the mind of, let's say, the West? The Indologists, the travelers, the contemporary journalists and all that. So let me take them one by one. About India, it is largely a matter of education and a matter of class. And it has also much to do with different regions of India and different sections of people. Then you can also look upon the whole thing in historical terms. You see, broadly speaking, there is ancient India, then there is later ancient India, India after the arrival of Islam when social conditions radically changed, and then there is India after the British, and finally India in last 20 years. Now India in last 20 years is given to horrible consumerism, and everything up, including sex, has taken up a very, very consumerist view of things, and I think that's the biggest problem, that now we have fallen into the trap, the general trap, global trap of treating the sex as one aspect of consumerist purpose of life. Now, if you go to the ancient ideas, then you find something very different. You find this division into artha, dharma, kama and moksha, where there is a perfect balance, or at least there is a balance on paper in terms of ideals. And there was also a society which provided you that kind of balance. Now, from the modern point of view, quite a few of the things which were practiced by ancient Hindus would be very unacceptable. For instance, the average male, the well-to-do male, other than the Brahmin, who was supposed to lead a life of utter simplicity and not of pleasure, or not of much pleasure, the average Indian Nagarik or citizen had his wife, and he also could visit the courtesan. So to go to the courtesan and have a sexual life there was also legitimate. Now this is something which not even modern India would accept, let alone the Christian West or half Christian West, or let us say post-Christian West, because all pre-Christian societies accepted the role of courtesans. Almost all societies had them. So this is a cause of misunderstanding. If you talk about classical Indian sexuality to modern Indians, they get annoyed, as a matter of fact, and they accuse you of distorting things. So this is one of the biggest reason for misunderstanding. And then on the other hand, they try to idealize it. You see, they think of sex only in terms, sometimes only in terms of pursuit of the divine. They would say, no, everything given there in ancient texts in terms of love is not of carnal nature, but it is love of the divine. So when people try to confuse between these four levels, the level of sexual desire, physical desire, desire as part of marriage and social function, desire as part of an aesthetic expression, and desire for love or longing for the divine. When you confuse them together, then you have all kinds of misunderstandings. And I think this is also the problem with a lot of Indologists and Western scholars. They are not able to see things as in four gradations or in four functions separate, because they want a single ideal of behavior, which was not practiced, which was not historically true, and which was also not philosophically acceptable. So modern consumerism was not acceptable to our ancestors. Any kind of abnegation or denying the body and affirming only divine pleasure was not acceptable. So you have to see the totality. But we have plenty of things which help us understand totality. As I said, we have dozens of texts which explain this thing to you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And my next question kind of ties in with one of the questions that has come in. How did ancient Indians see sexual orientation, and how were LGBTQ people treated by society? And one of my questions was, in addition to that, how was all of this viewed legally?
How much of it was legal?
No, just for the legal perspectives of how
okay.
non-binary people were treated.
Yeah, as I have a few articles and a couple videos on this, I have explained the position of ancient Hindu society. We were quite clear that creation has male, it has female, and then it has a third category, or Tritiya Prakriti. Now all these different distinctions which have come into existence today, queer and LGBT and this and that, they all come under the third category, and and gradations and variations are accepted. And what is very clear is that there was an acceptance of the fact that there are no two clearly defined genders, that there is a third gender, and that these people are God created. It would be stupid to try to cure them or to change them through medicine or through something else, because they are as natural as are men or women, because they are also Prakriti, they are given. Prakriti means something which is given to us, which is part of Srishti, creation. Now the question, what was their legal status? The legal status was not of equality in modern terms of equality, but that they were given a certain place in society. Most of them were given the place of sex workers, then performers, then musicians, then dancers, people associated with performing arts. Then there were other professions which were open to them, and sometimes those professions would include like guarding the harem and various other activities. So there was a clear understanding that these people have to be given a place which is a right legal place, and nobody can transgress upon it. And if you do, then there is punishment under law. The punishment we know about them in Manusmriti, in Artha Shastra and various other texts. So these were people who had their own rights, as we would say it in our modern terms. Also, what I'd like to point out, which is a little difficult for modern people to understand, that these were people without obligations or rina. You see, they were not supposed to perform charities. Dan was not incumbent upon them. Then these were people who were not supposed to perform shraddh. There were so many duties and obligations which required a lot of money and which had a lot of burden. All that was made free for them. So they had a life of much greater freedom. There were certain things in which they were at a disadvantage, but there were several other things in which they could lead a much freer life. And also those of the homoerotics or those of the third gender people who acquired excellence in arts, they were respected for their skills, highly respected. Yeah.
I see.
Right.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Gupt. And I think we have a related question that has come up.
Yeah.
What could be the reason to crave sexual sculptures on various temples, and why those are seen during certain dynasties, certain times?
Yeah. You see, I know this is it's a very vital question, and I have a very bitter experience of it myself. You see, something like 40 years ago, when I started the construction of a Nagar style temple, and when the temple came up to the level where the divine dancers had to be sculpted on it, then the modern Hindu donors, they said, we can't show nude statues on a temple. And when I said, well, this is the great Indian tradition, not just of Khajuraho, but of almost every temple. And if there are no divine dancers or even human dancers and sexual poses of up to a point in a temple wall, the outside, then the temple is supposed to lack something, and it is supposed to be an infertile place. So nobody believed me, and I could not go against the current of public opinion. Now, this is of course the modern distortion in India, and therefore this is also the big enigma for the people outside India as well. Now, sexuality or kama being part of the universe was part of the universe of the temple. You see, the temple is a microcosm which reflects the macrocosm. Now, if in the macrocosm there is sexuality of all kinds, not just the Apsara or the Gandharvas, but of every kind, then that every kind would be shown on the temple walls in a very natural way. So for our forefathers, that was something to be taken for granted, because it is out there. And any performing and any art which imitates life, which follows the principle of Loka Anukirtanam, Loka Anukirtanam, that is stating again, recreating what is found in Loka or the world outside, would recreate on the temple walls what it sees in the world. But what's most important, and this is where a large number of people, including Indologists and specialists, make a mistake, is that they don't look at this balance of four kinds. Sexuality, even on the temple walls, is defined in terms of what to do when, and who is to do it, and in what way. Now, there are some temples like Khajuraho temples, which to my mind are temples of tantric sadhana, and they are reflecting certain postures and ideas and things which reflect the inner spirit of an actual practice of Vam Marga, or the left hand sadhana. You see, some of the sculptures you see there, they look like yantras. So that reflects the sadhana which was practiced by the people and the society, and they were part of that whole tradition. And those are the Khajuraho temples. Then there are other temples, dozens of them, which have only a little bit of sexual poses, and they show them at a particular level. You see, the level of human activity, in which they sometimes include abnormal or even perverse sexual activity like sodomy, etc. So that was the free portrayal of art. But then what was made clear was that all of these things are to be seen in their proper place. And seeing them in their proper place is something which is not written on a temple wall. That is the job of an acharya to explain. That is the job of a specialist, somebody who is initiated, somebody who knows the Agama Shastra also, and how temples were constructed, and what was the whole philosophy in making that microcosm reflecting the macrocosm. So it's a subject of study. You see, you can't, like Wendy Doniger, just come around and say that Hindus have become Puritans, and where, as a matter of fact, that is the Victorian syndrome, which is still running around. For those who are initiated into the Indian arts, into Indian philosophy, all these things come in a very well-defined manner, in terms of time, in terms of place, in terms of what to do and what not to do. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And the Khajuraho example, Dr. Gupta, that you bring up, you're right. The sexuality is depicted towards the bottom. You don't
Yeah.
see any of those sexual sculptures as you look towards the Shikara in any of the temples in the complex. So that is very interesting. So everything has its place, and it should
Yeah.
be seen that way.
Right.
That's what we're saying. Okay, good. Thank you. A follow-up was, why did we see certain temples during certain dynasties? Was there, especially the sexuality depicted on temples? So what is the connection between certain dynasties, I guess, giving monies towards building temples?
I think you should not look upon it in terms of dynasties, but you should look upon it in terms of the philosophy or the sampradaya to which the patrons or the kings belonged. You see, they followed a certain sampradaya. Now, if the sampradaya happens to be a tantric sampradaya, as I am convinced was the sampradaya of the Bundelkhand region, or of the Odisha, Jagannath area, that there was a lot of Vam Marga practices there. So then they would, not just the king, but the people also. You see, that is something belonging to the whole region. So there were many people who were doing this, because this is a philosophic or a approach or a darshana or a sadhana which was being practiced at various levels by people. So it was a prevalent philosophy, it was a prevalent sampradaya, and I'm sure at that time there were proper gurus who would be initiating them into this. I'm not saying that there were no frauds or there were no charlatans at that time, because we have always had the pakhanda sampradayas and things like that. But there was the practice of that particular system. Whereas, if you see some other temples, or temples of a different sampradaya like a Jain sampradaya, then the amount of sexual depiction would be much less. However, there would be some degree of sexual depiction in every temple, because that was part of the dharma, artha, kama, moksha of Chaturvarga, of the four ideals of life. So everybody accepted that. That was an all India feature. That was not a regional matter. And so sex was given its proper place. But in places where sexuality was used as a sadhana, there would be what from our point of view, a great flowering or a great magnification of it. But we should not think that these were libertine people, or this was free for all, or this was a society which was degenerate. Because if you're degenerate, then you don't spend 200 years in making a temple. Then you don't make those marvelous works of art which require great planning and mental exertion and imagination. So that itself is a proof that this was a very disciplined society in this respect.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Gupta. One of the other questions that has come in is, all temples of sun are carved with erotic sculptures.
Yeah.
Is there a connection between the sun worship and sexuality? Or sex?
Well, I would say that this needs a lot of historical understanding in terms of understanding the local history. You see, what you find today is Modhera in Gujarat, the Surya worship, and what you find at Jagannath, Konark, etc., where along with sun worship, you also have the tantric worship. Now, this needs historical investigation as to how worship of the sun got associated with Tantra, because we don't find very many texts. I'm sure there are some, but it's not as if there is a general connection between the sun and the Vam Marga or the Tantric sadhana. See, wherever in temples you have a lot of sexual expression, it is part of the Vam Marga. Now, Vam Marga, or using sexuality as a way to climb to a deeper understanding, was a very legitimate sadhana or a legitimate methodology in India. And it was done through proper initiation and through proper teachers. All the texts of Vam Marga, they make it clear again and again that this is to be done under the supervision of a guru. So it was not that I get fascinated with something and I start practicing it. It's not like the modern adventurer and the modern practitioner who reads books and makes his own ideas and experiments with his life. No, it was done always and always as part of a spiritual training under somebody. Even when you made paintings, sexual paintings of yabi-yam and tantra paintings, or mandalas, or tankhas as they are called in a Tibetan area, it was done under proper initiation and in a monastery. It was not done independently. So this is something we must understand. It's not like a modern painter who just plunders history. You see, a modern painter can make any painting today, but you couldn't do that kind of a thing 200 years ago. You had to belong to a tradition to do it. And you had to do it under a social supervision with a social, religious, sampradayic application of it. It was not individualism at all. Yeah.
Thank you. And taking the Khajuraho example, just last time I visited, there's a Yogini temple, the ruins, right across from the pond, from the temple complex.
The 64 Yoginis.
You're right. Probably wasn't. Yes, it wasn't probably free for all. I mean, this was people who came to do sadhana, and it was guided, and there was a guru who probably took people through these practices.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Okay. Thank you. Another question that has come in is why do you think that modern Hindu society has developed a kind of complex around sex and sexuality? Is this because we've just kind of succumbed to old Victorian morality?
Yeah, we had two colonizations in last 900 or 1,000 years. The first was the Islamic colonization. Now, with the advent of Islam, our whole aesthetic sense, our whole practice of sexuality undergoes a major suppression. You see, we continued with the tradition of the courtesan in the Islamic period, but it was not the same, because the courtesan did not have the same status. The courtesan was not a vari vadhu. The courtesan was not a ganika. She was only a tawayaf or a rakasa, as the Arabic word is, which means she was a low status person meant to satisfy your sexual desire, and that's all. But that whole association with art, with even divinity, that was not part of the Islamic theology, and it was not part of the Islamic system of patronage. You see, that was the big change. So when that whole institution of the courtesan, or the what was called the Veshya Graha or the Veshma Graha, the Veshma Griha of ancient times, when it disappeared and it was no longer a highly cultured, established place in society, then the attitude of the people changed. You see, Islamic cities were more like encampments. The middle class people did not have a free life there. And the Hindu in general was leading a life of great suppression. So all good things, they had to be done either outside the city, somewhere in an ashram or somewhere far away from the cities in different other places, but it was no longer part of the urban culture. Then with the British, we had the second colonization. And this is when the great Victorian iron clamping started. And the whole notion of sex as dirty came in. In the Islamic period, sex is not dirty. You see, for the Islamic people, sex is something which you have all sanctions to enjoy. As a matter of fact, sexual enjoyment is part of heaven. In Khuld or in Jannat, you have the huras, the huris. So sexual pleasure is not considered as something dirty in the Islamic universe. But in the Christian erotic arts or Indian eroticism, when this whole syndrome was transferred on to the new educated class of India, then we had this big divide between the Anglophonic education and the traditional education. But then the traditional people, after the arrival of the British, were at the receiving end. They were poor people, they were oppressed people, they had to obey the ideals of the higher class. And the higher class had a Victorian mentality. And that's how the Hindu upper castes or the Hindu upper classes educated acquired that. And now people like Wendy Doniger are beating us with the same stick. You see, first they created this syndrome in us, and now they're accusing us of having this syndrome. Do you see the hypocrisy of it? Now Wendy Doniger comes around and preaches to us how free were our ancestors. But the fact is that it is the Victorian Christians who engendered this guilt in the Hindu mind. And now, let us say in past 20 or 30 years, with Bollywood consumerism, we have reached a third stage of perversion, where we treat our body as something to be enjoyed to such an extent that we just burn it out, that we don't understand the sanctity of it. Shariram khalu dharma sadhanam. See, sharira, this body, is a way of pursuing dharma. So it is that this body is something which is holy, which is sacred. It cannot be treated in a consumerist manner.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gupt. Another question has come in. Could you kindly explain the institution of Devadasis? There's a lot of literature that equates them with women who were exploited.
I know.
So-
It's a big topic, and I see my young friend Nitin Sridhar around here, and he'll tell you how much of this is a raging subject in South India. And now we have some great intellectuals sponsored by God knows from where, like T.N. Krishna, who are muddying the waters further. Well, Devadasi were the dancers in the temples who perform worship or puja or archana before the divine, before the Lord or the Devi. So they were dedicated, they lived there. Certainly they did not follow the institution of marriage, but there were certain ways defined for them to have sexual relation. And this went on, I think, till 17th, 18th century. But when the British saw that dancing in the temple, and they were horrified with it, and when they saw that there was also a section of these Devadasis or women who were dedicated to the temple, when they saw that these women had fallen to great poverty because there was no patronage to these temples and the patronage was denied and it did not exist. So then some of these Devadasis had to find different ways of survival. Then a whole discourse was created that dancing is bad, that erotic dancing is bad, that art and shringara is something which cannot go on with sex in such a way. And so the British tried to put an end to it. Then, as you all know, that the art was retrieved and the art was made into Bharatnatyam. The scholars, mostly who were Brahmins, they did the great job of bringing the art out of these Devadasis onto the modern performance and into this modern arena. And now we have a very peculiar discourse going on. First of all, we are blamed for retrieving this art. And then we are told that these Brahmins who retrieved these art, they purified it, they de-eroticized it. Now this is all not true. I mean, Shringar is part of dance, Shringar is part of worship. And this art was there with these Devadasis, as is shown by all kinds of texts going back not only to Jayadeva, who talks about the great dancer, Padmavati Charana Chakravarti, as he calls himself, Padmavati here is the great dancer of his times in the Jagannath temple. So, dance was always there, erotic dance was always there as part of Shringar and as part of the final stage of Shringar, which I talked about right in the beginning of this lecture. And these Devadasis or these women performing Archana were performing it. Now we have a discourse that these women belong to a particular community or they belong to a particular caste, and the Brahmins have denied them their original credit by taking over the art and propagating this art onto the modern stage. So I think this is not historically true. All this is largely modern caste war, modern ethnographic war, largely largely spawned, generated by the ethnic conflicts that ethnographers from the West are creating in our society. So
Okay.
Devdasis had a
Go ahead.
great, they were really marvelous women. They were sadhikas. Yes, they were ordinary women also. Yes, they had their lovers. Yes, they had their limited life. But some of them were great panditas, and I think nearly all of them were great artists. So we should not just look to the community or the caste to which they belonged.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Gupta. We have a question by Sideshji, whom I want to thank. I'm grateful that you always join us for the IndicForum talk, Sideshji. I am going to request Dr. Gupta to take up the questions related to feminism from ancient times in a separate talk that we will hopefully invite him to and he will accept. So Sideshji, save your question for that. Yes, Dr. Gupta, one last question that I want to kind of
Yes.
bring this to a full circle and a close. How
Right.
do we just kind of bridge the disconnect between how open-minded we were and how we are today? What are just your broad thoughts, just ending thoughts, please?
You see, it is a great task. First of all, we have to restore self-respect. I know the amount of disrespect which was injected into me when I went into a modern a school in Delhi, which was quote unquote high-end school, and where there was an Anglo-Indian principal and all that. And then I went to St. Stephen's College, one of the top colleges of the country. And I went through all that rigmarole, from in 50s and 60s of my education. Now, this was the period when we were made to feel guilty of our heritage, courtesy Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. His concept of modernity was that contemporary and modern is the real thing, and whatever was ancient was backward. Now, first of all, we have to get over this, and this applies to everything, not just sexuality. It applies to every aspect of our life, our medicine, our sciences, our arts, and each and everything. Now, once you do that, and once you really take pride in the fact, and it's a joy to take pride that our ancestors have given us so much. And when we say that they have given us marvelous things, then we are not putting down any other culture, because we are happy to share it with everybody in this world. And we have done that in the past. After all, China, which is currently in a cultural conflict with us, was sending scholars to study in India for 2000 years. So we have shared this great, glorious past. And we should have respect, and then after that, we should get down to hard, cold work. Or rather, we should get down and be willing to perspire. Udyamen hi siddhyanti karyani. It's only by hard work that you are able to achieve something. Which means that you study these texts, that you think about them, that you talk about them, that you make them contemporary, that you use them. And I would say one final thing here, that look, Europe made use of the Greek and the Roman texts and created a whole new civilization for itself. It created a renaissance, a genuine renaissance. It created a new civilization from somebody else's texts, because these were, the Sophocles and Aeschylus and Solon and all these great philosophers, they didn't belong to Britain or France or Germany. They all belonged to a different civilization which was much, much closer to our civilization, which the ancient Greeks were very close to the Vedic people. They were not close to the modern Europeans in any sense. But modern Europe created a new civilization for itself. Now, they did it, but they created a feeling in us through colonial period and through their students like Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, who was a Fabian socialist from Cambridge. They created this feeling in us that the Indian past, the Hindu past, is outdated. It is something perverse. It is nothing but hierarchy, caste hierarchy. It is the tyranny of Brahmins, and we have all these kinds of things. So this has been part of the colonial strategy. We have finally to get rid of it. We have nobody to blame now except ourselves. We are independent for 70 years, so we have to take care of ourselves.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Gupt. Again, this is not the end, but we will end this here today. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. This has been super wonderful. We all learned so much. And again, thanks to each of you who has joined, and every one of you is doing your own thing for Dharma. So thank you, thank you, thank you. So, and yes, recording will be available on IndicForum. Again, thank you, Dr. Gupt, and namaste.
Yeah, I thank you all.
Okay.
I thank you for paying attention. I'm really grateful.
Very good.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.